Darren, you need to give me the prompt and I will begin.
I am just waiting on Chris to let me know when we are good.
Chris is waiting for you. I just chatted you.
Well, good evening and welcome to the Urban League of Portland's 2020 Black Votes Matter Election Forum. My name is Michael Alexander and I serve as a member of the Albina Vision Trust Board, and I'm also a former president and CEO of the Urban League of Portland. On behalf of CEO Nikendia Harmon-Johnson, Board Chair Michael Llewellyn, the staff and the board of the Urban League of Portland, it's my honor to welcome you to tonight's forum. Tonight, we will first hear from 4 candidates for the office of mayor. This is the highest elected office in city government, and this election takes place during a time of unprecedented challenge, crisis, and urgent calls for redirecting our efforts on a range of issues facing our city, its residents, and the African American community. We thank you for joining us for this important opportunity to hear directly from 4 candidates who have come forward with the desire to lead this city. And now please allow me to introduce tonight's candidates, and I will do so in alphabetical order. They are Ozzie Gonzalez, Sarah Ayanna Rohn, Theresa Rayford, and Ted Wheeler. And again, I welcome you all. At this time, I want to take just a moment to review the ground rules and the sequence of events for our forum tonight. Candidates, I want to remind you to please stay muted if you're not answering a question. It really allows us to maintain a level of clarity for our audience in terms of their audio. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. And I will ask that you deliver these statements in alphabetical order. So we will begin with candidate Gonzalez, followed by candidates Ayanna Rohn, Rayford, and Wheeler. We will then move on to asking each candidate to answer a series of questions. You will have 2 minutes to respond, and there will be no option for rebuttal. We will continue to work our way down the list of candidates in alphabetical order for each succeeding question. For the first question, answers will begin with candidate Ayanna Rohn, and then we'll move down the list alphabetically. Second question, the candidate Rayford. Third question, candidate Wheeler, and then we will begin the process again. We anticipate asking 6 questions. After all of the candidate responses to the questions are complete, each candidate will then have 2 minutes to deliver a closing statement. And I will ask that those closing statements be delivered in reverse alphabetical order. So we will begin with candidate Wheeler, followed by candidates Rayford, Ayanna Rohn, and Gonzalez. I ask the candidates to please be conscious of their time. When you are within 30 seconds of your allotted time, our staff member will send each candidate a private note just to let you know where you are. If you go over time, there then will be a message sent to the audience and all of our candidates to let you know that your time is up. So thank you again for being with us. And let's begin with our opening statements. And I invite candidate Gonzalez to unmute and to offer your opening statement.
Thank you very much. And thank you especially to the Urban League of Portland for bringing us together on this evening to have a conversation for the sake of a better democracy and for the sake of a government that better serves Portland, Oregon. My name is Ozzie Gonzalez, And I'm running for mayor of Portland because I believe that Portland, it needs a different kind of leadership. It's clear that representation matters and that we need to be able to serve the public first and foremost by reflecting the public directly. So I'm stepping forward in this time of great uncertainty at a time when we are seeing the vulnerabilities that we experience when we don't have plans of action in place well in advance of crisis. And I'm coming forward with a bold vision about where we need to go as a society in this city of Portland. We are more diverse and mature than ever before. And as we grow, we need to address the issues that we had before COVID, like homelessness, housing, affordability, and lack of safe streets, with a vision towards where we want to go into the future as a city that is a part of the entire world and should have a relationship and a positive relationship with it. I'm an architect, an ecologist, and as a Latino, I know what it's like firsthand to experience marginalization and to grow up in a system that doesn't feel like it was ever made for you. Spanish is my first language, and I grew up in a household that honors hard work and the privilege of being able to wake up every day and take a breath of air and do good by the world. I'm proud to be here today, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to sit with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to candidate Ayanna Rohn.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for being here and doing this. I know this is a challenging time for everyone, and I want to thank everyone tuned in for taking time out of their busy lives and the struggles that they're facing to be a part of civic culture at this time. Now more than ever, we're facing challenges, and we need everyone to be able to stay connected to the politics of our city in order to shape better outcomes. I want to say a big thank you to KBOO for broadcasting this and to their listeners, to the Urban League for their legacy of advocacy, not just in Portland, but around the state of Oregon. I'm very impressed by your work. Also, Director Harmon Johnson for putting this together. I even need to give a shout out to your board chair, Michael Llewellyn. He's the one who inspired my podcast, the Our Portland Podcast, which folks can sign up for at sarah2020.com. And anything that I mentioned today, you can find out more about me there. We know that much didn't change between the first State of Black Oregon report in 2009 and later in 2015. So it's pretty safe to assume that those statistics haven't really changed much in subsequent years. And as we're looking at a looming crisis for Portland with budget cuts, with deep financial hardships, we know that that burden is going to be borne by Portland's already most vulnerable residents. And nowhere are the disparities greater than between Black and white Portlanders. And so we know that when it comes to things like thinking about homeownership, educational attainment, economic gaps, we have to think about how we are going to bridge that gap with clarity, how we're going to engage the community to lead in that work, how we're going to build relationships and not just do outreach in this town, because it's something that we struggle with, is moving beyond convening the steering committee and getting to results. And so what I'm hoping that we can see by electing a community-oriented mayor who's got an eye toward climate justice, a focus on green jobs, a focus on housing affordability and racial justice, that we can start to make great strides even despite the crisis that we're facing. I'm looking forward to discussing that all with you tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Candidate Rayford, I invite you to offer your opening statement. We need to take you off of mute.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for having me here today. It's good to see everybody here today. And I'm honored as a Portlander to be invited to this forum today, especially with my history here in Portland. My grandfather worked for the Urban League for about 30 years and put together their senior and aging disability services, which is a lot of the same type of work that I do now. Advocating in our family is a way of life. It goes back 4 generations here in Portland. And what I do understand and what I'm very realistic about is that for generations and for years and decades, we've entrusted our elected leaders to support our communities and the agencies and organizations that provide services and outreach. And one of the things that happens when it's an election season is that we get all these these proposals and opportunities of realistically what we need and the focus on equity. But a lot of times what we can see in audits, reports, and other state information services is that we're still lacking. We're still overrepresenting our people of color, and especially our Black communities in our foster care system. We're overrepresented in our jail system. We're overrepresented when we talk about death by homicide or suicide. And so what I want to do is make sure that for the next generation, the children right now, the youth right now that are actively organizing because of their elders, the same way that I've been active because of mine, I'm hoping that we get the opportunity now to create the society that benefits all of us, because it includes the voices and our lived experiences. We don't need to wait another round to see who's going to provide equity or who's going to, give us the promises that we've heard so long. I mean, you can read history books. Someone on KTU the other day said that I was a preservation buff. And really, I searched through audits and information to see accuracy for things that we need to change and to find deficiencies. And there's been a deficiency in the promises of equity. There's been a deficiency in the distribution of resources. And so we need to accommodate a new day. And I'm running for office right now in hopes that we'll get that opportunity through direct engagement and building out that new city framework of government that will include all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now, Candidate Wheeler.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Urban League for hosting us tonight. Thank you for KBOO Radio for broadcasting this, and thank you for everybody who's taking time to listen tonight. This is really great, and I appreciate it. So I sit before you as the first candidate this century seeking to be reelected as the mayor of Portland. I'm somebody who was born and raised here. I chose to raise my daughter here. I'm a very proud product of the public education system in our community. And every day I serve as your mayor is a true privilege. Like everybody listening, I have a stake in this community. I'm not perfect. I've certainly made mistakes as mayor, but I've done a lot of things right too. And I think, frankly, the smartest thing I've done as mayor is I have elevated equity and inclusion to be the centerpiece of my administration. And I don't just mean the folks that I've elevated to leadership or decision-making positions, like Chief Outlaw, the first African-American woman to hold that title, Maurice Henderson, the first African-American man to serve as the chief of staff to a mayor, but also in the specific policy positions that we enact, whether it's around housing, whether it's around economic prosperity, whether it's around budget decisions we make, we have elevated equity. For example, the North-Northeast housing strategy, working with our partners in the community, we exceeded our goal for affordable housing and workforce production. And literally 550 households received critical home repairs as a result of that program. Around economic prosperity, I don't care if the community is economically prosperous if it's not shared prosperity. And that's why the work we did around creating the Inclusive Business Resource Network, where 1,000 small businesses, the majority owned by people of color, receive care, or whether it's the Portland Means Progress that gets young people engaged in employment and our opportunities in our community. Proud to be here, proud to serve. I'm honored and humbled every day, and I hope you'll support me this time around too. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thank our candidate. We are now going to begin our series of questions. And my format will be to read the question and to then move to the first candidate. And actually, we will begin the responses with candidate Ayanna Rohn. The question: across the country, the COVID-19 pandemic is attacking the health of Black and Brown communities much harder than others. As the health and economic crisis continues to unfold locally, what will you do to ensure that Black Portlanders and other people of color have the public health and economic resources needed to survive and recover?
This is such a challenging question because we know that from the first 1,000 days that our neighbors of color, especially Black Portlanders, are on the planet, their life outcomes are already determined largely from public health disparities, educational disparities, housing disparities, that they will struggle to remediate against the odds for the rest of their life. And I don't think that Portland has done a very good job addressing, especially some of those early childhood impacts and maternal health impacts in ways that we could. But it's a little late for us to do that in the middle of the crisis. So the most important thing that I believe that we can do is make sure that people have housing security. There's a place where Oregonians should be doing much better, which is in terms of food security. We're in a robust, fertile valley where we should be making sure that we are tapping into every resource, not only to be creating abundant food and closing those loops on the food systems, but making sure that Black business owners and Black entrepreneurs have access to wealth creation, even in the midst of a crisis. We need to make sure that Black businesses are prioritized in recovery and Black households are stabilized, because we know that as long as Black Portlanders are adversely affected, we can't call ourselves resilient, because it will undermine our capacity to actually stabilize our city as a whole. This is one place where sometimes the numbers run against us because it just seems like the population is much smaller here. But really, when you look at the amount of inputs that it would take to make sure that Black Portlanders are safe and well, it's relatively small investment for large outcomes.
Thank you. Candidate Rayford, we'll ask you the same question.
Yes. Do you mind restating the question?
Absolutely. Across the country, the COVID-19 pandemic is attacking the health of Black and Brown communities much harder than others. As the health and economic crisis continues to unfold locally, what will you do to ensure that Black Portlanders and other people of color have the public health and economic resources needed to survive and recover?
Thank you, Michael. And what we are learning from the COVID crisis right now, this current pandemic, is that the inequities that Black people in America are facing are not brand new due to the pandemic. What we're seeing is the unraveling and the light bulb of the inequities. We're seeing that the lack of health access is not only because we don't want to eat healthy, but it's because we live in poverty most of the times. We live in communities that are food deserts. We live in housing and public housing, and we go to school in public housing institutions that don't have big outcomes or successful investments to make those outcomes come out better for our families, so that we can receive opportunities that other communities, and really the majority of our community here in Portland, receive on an everyday. As an advocate in our community, what is even more harmful, and what we have to realize, is that not only are these things systemic, but we are operating as people that are participants in denying people access to services and rendering them things that can associate with having a better, healthier, safer life. And a lot of that is because of our own biases, and these systemic biases kind of create the protocol for us to discriminate against people. And so a lot of times when I'm doing a lot of the community organizing and what I call advocacy, is to go ahead and get audits so that we can find out ways to be more effective and efficient in the way that we serve our communities. And if we just look at what the auditors are saying to us, we have to have more intentionality behind what we're doing with our communities. For instance, organizations like the Urban League and other agencies that do civic participation. I would love to see a city that is in participation with that type of situation, so that they have the resources that they need to fully engage with communities, so that when those voices and those experiences are brought up, that we're able to build policy around it that is not only sustainable, but adds a foundational system of support. We have to standardize and prioritize decriminalizing poverty against all people. That won't happen with the current administration. That's why I'm running.
Thank you. Candidate Wheeler. You're still on mute. There you are. Nope, now you're back. There you go.
Boy, you'd think I'd figure this out at some point. Look, not only is it going to happen during the current administration, it already is. I have stated that my biggest fear about this pandemic is the inequities that existed prior to the pandemic around health outcomes, educational outcomes, economic prosperity outcomes, and other outcomes would not only not be fixed by the intermediary actions, they will be worsened. These disparities will grow if we are not intentional in how our recovery resources are spent. And that's why the city of Portland immediately sent funds to households, low-income households in our community. Up to 2,000 households received $1 million in total of support to stay in their housing, not only things like rent support, but essential household supplies, medical care, other household needs. We did that by reallocating funds in our housing budget. Additionally, when it came to small business resilience and recovery, the first businesses in our community to receive those dollars were those owned and operated by communities of color, because they were the first hit and they were the hardest hit. And as I look at the recovery, we now finally have a letter from the United States Treasury telling us how we can spend the $114 million they've allocated towards us. And it includes all of these things that we're talking about: food delivery, closing the digital divide, telework capabilities, paid family leave, homeless population support, housing support. The list goes on. And I have been aggressive, and the city of Portland and my colleagues on the council have been aggressive. We will continue to show the kind of leadership that we've shown up to this point in the crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Candidate Gonzalez.
Thank you very much. It's that sort of continued trajectory that I'm a little bit concerned about that is going to happen, because part of the statistics that we have to acknowledge is that there are programs that have helped to the community, and there are programs that have been put out recently funding specifically for the business community. But much like the programs that have been put in place now for COVID, the programs are also not being distributed equitably. Much like the previous programs of subcontractor inclusion or any other programs where there is trying to overcome some disparity. Even we look at the programs of the open and honest accountable elections are another example. These are all programs that are there to address disparities, but if you look at the statistics of how those funds are allocated, there is disparity within the disparity. And not all the folks that are in most need are the ones that are in the highest likelihood to qualify. So we have to have leaders that are not only looking at these programs now and using the equity lens in the rearview mirror to look at things in retrospect through studies and analysis. You have to be able to look forward and do this with intention. I understand as a designer that things like redlining and so many other rules, policies that were created to hold down communities of color were done so by intentional design. And so with intentionality, we have to look forward and design programs and systems that are going to look at these issues specifically and know what are the outcomes that we're looking for. So if we want to be specific within the Black community, we have to begin by leveraging those leaders within the community that are going to help lift up and provide that recovery that needs in the near term. So I will work with community organizations, churches, to help create early pathways to bring people back into employment. And that's just the beginning.
Thank you. Our next question, we will respond in the order of candidates Rayford, Wheeler, Gonzalez, and Ayanna Rohn. The question is, Black Portlanders are priced out of every single neighborhood in the city of Portland, meaning that the median monthly income of Black-led households is less than 3 times the median rent or mortgage throughout the city. Talk about your plans to make Portland a city where we can all live, enjoy, and afford.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry for the muting. And also there's a loud bell in the background, so hopefully disturb us. So one of the reasons that I started an advocacy and a legal clinic was so that we could start systemically removing barriers from opportunities in our community. And what we all know now, 10 years later, since I've been, hanging out in archives and trying to go back and forth to the state capitol, is that the underlying issue in Portland, again, is not the lack of fair access to an opportunity. I'm a fourth generation Oregonian. My mom's brothers in that generation, they went to college. Some of their parents even went to school and went to college. They owned businesses, they owned houses. They built this community that I grew up in, which was very fortifying. We had politicians, we had people in all different types of industries. But the underlying problem that we have here in Portland, we can't deny it. And it's racism. It's the fact that our system has been owned and controlled by the same variables of the status quo. And in order to make things work in that system of, let's say, white supremacy or patriarchy, we don't want to undermine the process. But what we need to realize is that when we seek to address certain issues that are harmful to us, it's showing that the process is unfavorable to our humanity. It's showing that the process does not allow for a standard of success. And so we have to change those processes. And I think that when we talk about the issue of white supremacy and the violence of policy that undermines the basic human rights and access to people, that again, it's going to take the leaders from those communities. For the last 12 months on this campaign, we've been talking about racial equity. I've heard at too many different forums, what is our plan? How are we going to address these inequities? And again, we can go back to our history books. Everything that we've said has already been said. And for my community and for the Black community, everything that I could imagine to want to do has already been done. Our elders consumed themselves with creating an opportunity for our future generations. We're not realizing those opportunities, not because they were ineffective as parents or leaders or community members, but because we're working within a system that is undermining us because it does not value our input and our access. I've seen this a lot through this campaign. I've been in Portland my whole entire life. There's nothing that we can say that has not already been said, even in this race. Until we change the leaders that can effectively bring our community together and have the courage, and like you said earlier, Michael, the humility to serve on a level of decency and ethics, just because those experiences do give us that guidance, nothing is going to change.
Thank you. Okay. Candidate Wheeler?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. First of all, I would say we have changed the leadership. And the leadership that we've changed is we've moved to a community-based, a community-centered approach to improving our housing situation. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, let's look at the Northeast housing strategy. That is community-run. It works in partnership with the Housing Bureau, and I'm the commissioner in charge of the Housing Bureau. We have created new affordable housing in North and Northeast Portland. In fact, we've exceeded the original goals of the strategy. As I mentioned earlier during my opening statement, we've also helped keep people in their housing so that they would not be displaced. The city council, prior to my getting there, but I strongly have supported the preference policy and making sure that as it has rolled out and as it's been implemented, we've had a strong rollout. And a PSU study just showed that 84% of the households benefiting from our preference policy are Black families who wanted to return or stay in North and Northeast housing. Of course, as I also said, we have been nimble with the resources we have. We allocated funds to 2,000 households through the through the Portland Housing Stability Fund, and we intend to put more of our COVID-related resources into that. We pushed the overall strategies around the 2035 Central City Plan. The housing bond, which was brought to us by the community, we have implemented it. We've worked with the community to implement it. I slowed down the implementation by 2 months, and the mainstream media destroyed me on that decision. But I did it because frontline communities, especially the African-American community, asked us to slow down and include them in the goals. We have exceeded the expectations and the promises of that bond. And finally, through the Housing Bureau, we have had 2 record years of affordable and workforce housing production under my leadership. We're off to a good start with the community. Let's keep working together. Let's keep moving forward, making progress as we've already been doing.
Thank you. Candidate Gonzalez.
Thank you. This question brings up this concept of inclusion. And I want to make 2 points about inclusion that we really need to think about here in the city of Portland today. We are a city that's full of equity lenses and equity, inclusion, and diversity policies. And you're hard pressed to find a nonprofit or an organization today that hasn't been working on one of those and has it somewhere on a website or in their policy files. But at the same time, there's an echo there somewhere. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that inclusion is something that we talk about in Portland by and large as though there is this giving a seat at the table, without recognizing that the table doesn't belong to the power system. Inclusion, from the perspective of inclusion practitioners, I being one of them who's giving courses on these ideas, I really promote that inclusion is about government doing its job better. If we don't have someone from the front line who experiences those issues of addiction or homelessness or affordable housing concerns with a full-time job, those are lived experiences that would be missing from a conversation we need to solve the problem. The second point I want to make about inclusion has to do with how we value the contributions of folks of color. The stories of the contributions of the Black community here in Portland, Oregon are not something that are common knowledge the way we tell the stories of the mainstream dominant culture's contributions to the history line. There's a lot of story of North America that isn't there either. And we need leaders that understand that when you include people, you're not doing a favor to them, you're doing a favor to the system itself. And the table that you invite them to is never yours. It's always theirs, and you're the one setting it. That's the kind of leadership we need to adapt. And it's a different approach to leadership. And it's what I bring.
Thank you. Candidate Ayanna Rohn.
Yes, thank you. And Mr. Gonzalez is right in terms of inclusion. It's really too bad that it was 2 months before these policies are being passed, and we're now talking to frontline communities to get their feedback about how they're supposed to look. They should have been shaping them from day one, and anti-displacement, frankly, should have been at the top of the agenda for the entire comprehensive plan update. And the fact that we're thinking about these things after the fact, I think, shows that we've had our priorities slightly out of whack and not been talking to the right people. The same with the right to return policy in Northeast Portland, and the fact that the Neighborhood Housing Strategy Oversight Committee actually said that the right to return policy wasn't working, and the mayor admitted it's an abject failure and the buck stops with me. Well, I think the buck stops here in terms of, do we really want someone who's willing to say something's an abject failure and then not double down on fixing it? When it comes right down to it, there are 3 things that we need to look at on this front. 1, accountability. What are we doing in our housing bureau for whom and how? What is going on in that bureau? I'm not sure it's transparent to the public. 2, we need to make sure that home ownership is on the table. When you look at the home ownership rate between Black Portlanders and white Portlanders, the disparity, it's in reverse who has access to that. And finally, we need to close the income gap, because ultimately we know that's what's going to stabilize Portland's families and help them go to the same schools over their lifetime or live in neighborhoods they desire, is making sure that that income gap is closed. And unlike climate change, which we have attempted to tackle with intention based on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we have actually not tackled racial inequality with the same focus. And I think that looking at something like what I'm calling the 30-30-30 plan to reduce income disparity for 30-year-old Portlanders by 2030 by 30%, would be a way for us to start thinking about really moving the needle through targeted strategic investments over time to close that income gap, especially for our youngest Black Portlanders.
Thank you. All right, we will move on to our next question, and the order of response will be Candidate Wheeler, Candidate Gonzalez, Candidate Ayanna Rohn, and Candidate Rayford. Since these metrics became available in the 1970s, the Black unemployment rate has typically been 2 to 3 times higher than the general unemployment rate in Portland. Given that the rate of unemployment is rising during COVID-19, how would you ensure that people of color will have access to career track employments in the city? Candidate Wheeler, you're still on mute.
I knew that, Michael. I was just testing you. Thank you for reminding me. Look, this has been one of the centerpieces of my administration, is shared economic prosperity. As I said up front, I don't really care if there is prosperity in our community if it's not shared broadly, and it historically has not been. And that's why the number one thing I have done in my economic development strategy through my economic development task force has been to create the Portland Means Progress Initiative. It is intentionally focused towards young people of color, particularly African Americans, to get them into the labor force and also to include a culture of inclusivity and diversity. So I went out there and I met with private sector partners one at a time. We have companies from 2 people to 5,000 employees, and they've signed on and they're helping to do this. We also created the Inclusive Business Resource Network in 2017 through Prosper Portland. I'm the commissioner in charge. The goal there was to support minority and business owners of color who want to start their own businesses. And right now, 70% of the people receiving either funding or technical support are people of color. We also created through the Broadway Corridor Plan, this is our next big, great place in our community. I said, I don't want to just do another Pearl District. I want something that's inclusive, that engages other people in our community in the economic opportunity around the Broadway Corridor. So we have a coalition of individuals. It is broad, working to create a community benefits agreement. We're close, I think, to the final negotiations on that, and it's going to redefine the way that we do large-scale development in the city of Portland. The Mercatus program, which came through the community, which we continue to operate, that is supporting businesses that are 100% people of color. And of course, when it comes to specific projects like the North Russell, North Williams Street proposal, we're letting the community lead it. That is the African American community leading the initiative on how we, the city, engage on a very significant economic development project. So it's putting the community first at the table where the decisions are made and the resources get allocated. That's how we're going to continue.
Okay. Candidate Gonzalez.
Thank you. One thing I will never do as mayor is let you lead. I will ask you to please lead, because I need you to lead in places where this is most impacting the community that you're most invested in. And that's to recognize that there are things that are blind spots to me. And I know that having folks that can complement those blind spots is just how I will get better at doing my job. So I am out there working every day to help address the issues, like the helping provide technical assistance to the companies in Mercatus program, and helping with some of the inclusion programs and capital projects today. The Portland Building renovation project is the city's largest capital improvement project. It also happens to have the most aggressive diversity and inclusion goals in the city's history. I've been the program manager for that project. So some of the programs our mayor mentions require folks on the ground to implement these things. And in my experience, one thing I've learned is that the numbers do not tell the whole story. I could say the Portland Building project has exceeded all of its goals with bringing on a diverse workforce, having the most women and the most minorities percent of labor on the project of any project in the city's history. However, I can also tell you that the experience of those folks of color and the women entering that workforce aren't always having the best experience, because they're not always walking into an inclusive environment. And so changing the culture of that inclusivity requires the leaders from the top to understand that inclusion really is not a favor you grant and bestow upon others. And it also means that representation is recognized as the most important thing. So I want to bring representation across the chain of command. So you have leaders, mentors, teachers, and folks across the board that reflect you so that every young person sees people in front of them that they can relate to.
Thank you. Candidate Ayanna Rohn.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear talk about Prosper Portland and racial disparities, because I think there are a lot of Black Portlanders who still remember the Portland Development Commission and probably don't trust that institution all that much to be a change agent. And I don't know that the work in rebuilding that trust is as thorough or as complete as the incumbent is claiming. We talk a lot. Mr. Gonzalez is right in terms of things like Portland means progress or the tech pledge. But then when you click through to the data on, are these programs really moving the needle on disparities, wealth disparities, income disparities, stabilization for communities? Are we having an impact? I'm not sure that we are, and I'm not sure how we would know if we are or not. It's going to be important for us through this next phase, which is going to be very lean, for us to have a small business-minded person, not a corporate-minded person in leadership at the highest level of the city, to help make sure that we're steering our precious resources toward small business and entrepreneurship. I proposed actually taking a position out of Prosper Portland and putting it right in the mayor's office. That will be the agent, a single point of contact for small business and entrepreneurship, who's going to actually be charged with developing the data so that we can actually track how the entrepreneurial ecosystem in Portland is having impacts. How do we know if our data systems aren't adequate, if we're not collecting the right data, whether or not our investments are having an impact? So we need to actually have someone popped out above Prosper Portland so they can even look at the activities inside Prosper Portland to see, is this even working or not? When we look at things like the Hill Block project, in contrast to Broadway Corridor, and you look at places where there are disparities in capital investments, and how do we really try to not only develop Portland's future, but remediate the ills of the past, we still have an awful lot of work to do. And I have a disposition toward doing that healing work. And I hope that Portlanders would trust me to be a good accomplice in that work.
Thank you. Candidate Rayford.
Thank you so much. I wanted to say a couple of years ago, right after the death of my nephew, I was wondering why we didn't have more vocational training available to students coming out of high school that weren't going to go to college, because I came home from Texas and I saw what, in my opinion, was urban renewal, right? I saw a lot of growth in my community. I saw a lot of the blight that was there becoming kind of rehabilitated. But then I had a relationship with the Architectural Heritage Center at the same time. So I kind of learned about some of the discrepancies behind what that urban renewal was for our community, what it meant for people who had been, living there their whole lives, running businesses, raising their children. Some people had never been out of Portland, and let's talk about 2 or 3 generations that probably haven't been to another state outside of the city of Portland, much less, just north and northeast. But at the time, we were going through what I learned was displacement and gentrification. And I saw the inequities and I saw them moving fast. And I kind of wondered, I said, how in the heck did we go from a thriving community where people were like building wealth and building opportunities for their children, investing in their futures, to displacement, mass incarceration, lack of opportunities through our education system, no access to housing, because again, if you're living in poverty and you're not properly educated, there is no resource that can accommodate that. And we see that with our housing issue. We see the people that are houseless are Black and brown children and families. And our elders. And so one of the things that I wanted to understand was that how do we provide urban renewal to the city of Portland without educating those people that would be most vulnerable? Why didn't we bring the opportunities to the people that had those businesses, that had those houses, that maintained those communities for so many generations, and were enabled through that community prosperity to build the future that, people in my neighborhood in my time had? What happened? And the fact that we've never created a substantial standard that provides educational assets that don't go away when the plan is gone, that don't go away when that department is gone, that don't rely on just that
Teresa, I think your mute may be on, and it may be that the time limitation ran out, but okay, thank you. All right, I'm going to move on to our next question, and the order of response will be candidate Gonzalez, candidate Ayanna Rohn, candidate Rayford, and candidate Wheeler. According to the Urban League's 2019 Black Civic Census, Black Oregonians overwhelmingly feel that they do not have a voice or representation in their local government. How will you work to change that? And we'll begin with candidate Gonzalez.
Thank you. The way I've learned to enter a room when I have a lot to learn and I am just one perspective among many is to listen and to empathize. I intend on having folks within my cabinet that have a deep historical investment and a deep knowledge of the history of the Black community in Portland, because that is really the word history I tend to balk at even using. It's not that long ago, and in fact we're still exhibiting the results of decisions made not very long ago. So this is not the history. I would say it's the legacy of everything that's been contributed, even that which has not been recognized. Having that visibility very close is key. That's institutional knowledge in the story of our city. And that is a very important part of a relationship that has to be built. I recognize that I don't have that visibility the way folks that have experienced it firsthand here in Portland have. But I do come from a place where I grew up in a subjugated community where I was afraid of walking outside of my own home because I knew that the patrol vehicles that were in my neighborhood were not there to protect me from anything. They were there to protect the world from me. And I know that that's something that we have communities in Portland feeling to this day. So I walk in with a lens that understands and does not need to be explained what it's like to have that feeling. I want to make sure that our young people in Portland don't have that feeling. And I want to make sure that whether we're talking about policing or education, we're bringing people that represent the community of Portland and the Black community of Portland especially in a way that is lifting up others behind them. And I'm going to get out of the way as much as I can.
Thank you. Candidate Ayanna Rohn.
Yeah, this is such an important topic of conversation, especially with the upcoming mandated charter review process in 2021. You know, we've heard an awful lot of talk about the City Club report on the Commission form of government and how we know that's reinforcing racial disparities in our city. But what we haven't really looked at is, and I think that this COVID crisis makes clear, is that chaos is the new normal. And as we look at that charter, not just on the way that we want to elect our representatives or govern ourselves at the council level or manage our city or do our budgeting, we need to think about the suite of government reforms that are going to be necessary to keep our government nimble, responsive, adaptive, and accountable to the people. So on my website, sarah2020.com, we've released a good government policy. And I encourage folks to go take a look at it, because what it does is look at everything from the weak mayor commission form of government to participatory budgeting, to how we do our voting. So it's not runoff voting. So you wouldn't have to choose between me and other candidates that you like, but you could rank us and reduce the rancor in our electoral politics. It includes things like, how do we make decisions at the neighborhood level? There's been a lot of divisiveness at the neighborhood level. And what does it mean for us to actually engage at that scale without that having be de facto white homeowner association politics? We need to make investments in a healthy democracy now more than ever, because when we are in chaotic times, whether they're driven by climate change, whether they're driven by, say, national elections and the alt-right, whether they're driven by a pandemic or economic crises, we need a healthy democracy here at the foundation of everything that we're trying to do in Portland. And so my small donor campaign means that I am accountable to thousands of Portlanders. My campaign is on track to set a record for the highest number of donors ever in any City of Portland election. And so that means that the full power of the people will be behind an administration in which we're thinking about a healthy democracy for future generations.
Thank you. Candidate Rayford.
I just wanted to say again, I'm running based on accountability. I want to run as an anti-corruption candidate that can bring a change to City Hall. I'm going to go ahead and piggyback off of what Sarah said about changing the commission form of government, because that's one of the ways that I want to build in community participation. I've been through 96 neighborhoods over the last 18 months asking people to vote for us. I've had campaign volunteers in 600 numbers, going through neighborhoods, showing up at coffee meetups, showing up at libraries, showing up at parks, doing whatever they can to come together to organize, just to get the vote out to people that usually don't even know who the mayor is, usually don't have anybody knocking at their door. We didn't ask for money. Sometimes people donated to us because we knocked on their doors, but a lot of the times we didn't really even ask for money, because the biggest benefit and asset that we got out of this campaign was being in direct contact with people that have their opportunity to share with us what matters to them. And so what we did was we also created a survey where people could even go on our website. They didn't have to wait for somebody to knock on their door. And they talked to us through that survey, and we built the People's Platform. You can see it on my website, which is TeressaRayfordForMayor.com. And a lot of the things that I want to do, they're very radical. It seems sometimes to people as if I want to change and establish a new system. But I do. I believe in reconstruction. And so if you elect me, we're going to go ahead and get off to a really good start, because I trust what the people believe in. I trust, and I don't mind serving from that basis. So contact me right now, sign up to phone bank with us. You can check us out again at TeressaRayfordForMayor.com. And I hope that you choose change. I don't want to run a campaign on fear. Donald Trump right now is telling us that if, he's going to be the president because of coronavirus. I don't want people to think that we have to live in a world of fear when we can live in a world of hope. And change is on the front line. That's where it starts and that's where it ends. So elect me on May 19th to be Portland's next mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Candidate Wheeler.
Yeah, thank you. The answer, I think, in part based on what I'm hearing from people in the community, just to reiterate what the question was, it was that a recent report showed that Black Americans overwhelmingly feel that their voices are not represented in government. Getting back to that issue, my administration has been keenly aware of that, because my administration is largely made up of people of color who feel that they personally were shut out of the process as they were growing up here in the city or somewhere else. And so for every major issue that we address, we engage people, we ask them to participate. People often contact us and say they want to participate. And just a couple examples, the Northeast Housing Program that I just mentioned before is very much focused on African-American households in North and Northeast Portland and finding stability. That program is led by people in the community. The North Russell, North Williams block development, that is the first time that mostly African-Americans on that committee have the tools like tax increment financing working for them rather than against them and displacing them. And that's I think, a good step in the right direction. Around police reform, the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing is largely run by folks who are in the community who self-identify as Black. If you don't think they're independent from me, look at what Ayanna, the Crow chair, said today about the consultant who was hired by the Department of Justice. They're completely independent. They've helped elevate the conversation from the community. And finally, when it comes to homelessness, we work with a whole array of partners who are in the community, who know the community, who the community trusts, who aren't part of government. And that has proven to be a really successful strategy of this administration. We're going to continue to do more of that going forward. So thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I'm glad we had a chance to talk about it, if briefly.
All right, I'm going to point out that we are, as always, I think the discussion has been richer than the time that we had set aside. So rather than close on 2 questions, there's one additional question that I'd like us to go through. And again, if folks can be cognizant of time, and then we do want to afford people the opportunity for their closing statements. So this will be answered in the order of candidate Ayanna Rohn, candidate Rayford, candidate Wheeler, candidate Gonzalez. The U.S. Department of Justice recently found that the Portland Police Bureau, whose arrest of Black people far exceeds their representation in the population, is in compliance with the 2014 settlement related to police use of excessive force. Are you happy with the Police Bureau's performance over these 6 years? What would you seek to change if you are not? Beginning again with candidate Ayanna Rohn.
Yes, and thank you for this question. I'm sorry that we have to keep having this difficult conversation year after year. I don't think that we can pat ourselves on the back as having accomplished much when we had the highest number of police shootings last year in a decade. And as long as the Albina Ministerial Alliance is not happy with that settlement, it really doesn't matter to me what Trump's DOJ has to say about it. It's the people of Portland who are most affected by Portland's policing that have to lead on this situation. I was not happy initially with the dismantling of COAB. I know it was very dysfunctional, but I saw at the heart of that dysfunction was underinvestment and a clarity. The outside consultants there were largely the problem. But I also don't know that we fully funded its replacement. And we do need much more rigorous community oversight of policing. However, my campaign is run by a young Black Lives Matter activist who the incumbent actually locked out of City Hall. I know that he locked candidate Rayford out at several times too. I just don't know that that's the kind of person that we can trust to lead us in things like a sanctuary city policy or through the era of Black Lives Matter and thinking about anti-racist policing in sanctuary cities if we're not making sure these are people who will always be welcome in Portland City Hall, even when they disagree, and making sure that we're making deep investments in community oversight of policing, rethinking the discipline guides so that we can make sure that we're getting rid of biased police officers and making sure that everything that we're doing in terms of outcomes and accountability is shaped by the community and that we're not just consulting them after the fact about how this should or shouldn't be going or whether we are or are not doing well.
Thank you. Candidate Rayford.
So it's very important to understand how politics and how the history of Portland policing in Portland plays out. In 2014, when Judge Simon gave us the verdict that put them into a situation where they had to be in compliance, where most of the community was asking for training, where we developed the COAB in partnership with these different agencies outside of Chicago and different organizations, including our mental health organizations. It was the smoking mirrors situation that we find ourselves in. The whole reason that we started the Citizens Review Committee back in 1981 was because of the violence and the assaults that were happening to people in the Black community by the Portland Police Department, and knowing what that means as far as creating a circumstance for there to be a board or a commission or a citizens review. And again, being a person that likes to audit processes and policies to see how we can make them more effective. What I've seen is that these systems have built themselves or have been created as a standard for pacification to basically pacify the need for engagement, but there's really no strong teeth in the policies that's given to the order of the people who participate either as volunteers or as paid consultants. And again, that helps us, not be accountable to people that are being harmed by the police. One of the things that I did in 2014 and 15 and on, one of the reasons that I even started getting into police accountability is because my nephew was killed in gun violence, and there wasn't even any life-saving devices available for the officers or the first responders to save his life. And going back and forth to the state legislator, what I realized is that the reason that there is such a specific deterrent for us to have access to police and to public safety is because we are considered the problem. And a lot of times when you use the words at risk or marginalized, those are ways to criminalize someone's part of society. And so it's not going to change until our leadership changes. I've wanted to go ahead and try to see if we can get special prosecutors so that we could hold police accountable throughout the state of Oregon, but we don't have leaders in City Hall that are utilizing their legislative
Candidate Rayford, I think we've run out of time, but thank you. Candidate Wheeler. And I think there we go.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And this is a serious issue. And I appreciate the question. First of all, I respectfully disagree with my opponents on this front. First of all, changing the culture of an organization is not something that happens overnight. It is something that does need to happen. I said it when I ran last time. I backed it with leadership changes. And I just want to remind people that when I hired a new police chief, I put as the first sentence of the job description that anybody who wants to be the police chief in this city must have an understanding of the history of racism in this community and how it bleeds over into the present day and the impact that it has on the relationship between the police bureau and the community. And there were a lot of people in this community, including within the police bureau, who strongly objected to that language. They believed that it was over the top. I believed it then, and I believe it now. And I brought in new leadership in Chief Outlaw. She and her deputy chief, who is now the chief, instituted implicit bias training and de-escalation training, which I continue to support. They redoubled our recruiting efforts, particularly to find young people of color who want to engage in policing, because the way you change culture isn't just from the top down, it's also from the bottom up, bringing in people who understand the value of community. And we've been able to do that. And the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, I think my opponents are selling that group short, and I would encourage them to participate in some of those meetings, talk to the co-chairs, talk to the young African-American folks who have engaged as our youth advisors or youth appointees on that council. You will find that they are strong, they are independent, they are as committed as I am to a culture of change, but they also support the hard work of the men and women in our police bureau. So I hope we'll think a little broadly about how to change culture in this community and not just say change. It's not about change, it's about improvement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Candidate Gonzalez.
Well, I see that there's a couple of things that we're not really acknowledging in the policing conversation. And while accountability and oversight are definitely instruments of check to a system that's been run amok for way too long, as far as how it's been serving the community, I believe that there's opportunity here to be able to take us to the next step of what we really need to accomplish here, which is not just oversight of policing. I think we need community ownership of policing. And I think it needs to be a two-way street. The North Star that I envision for us to lead towards is a place where policing is done by folks that are deeply invested in the communities that they are serving, so that the outcomes of those communities are some outcomes that that individual, that officer is feeling a vested interest in ensuring are good outcomes. Because that's one of the systemic breaks right now in the system. Much like our governance model does not have district representation, same thing with our policing model. It goes against the grain of the culture to have folks enforcing in the communities where they live. And I know that there's a lot of great logic behind that, but it was a step that took us down the path that we are far down, decades down today, that we need to change. And I believe we need to have community ownership. I've seen pipelines for workforce development in the construction industry. I think we could learn a lot there into policing. I'm talking about having children in the K through 12 programs learning about policing, forensics, private investigation, having the young cadet programs, having apprenticeship programs, and showing people the pathways to being part of that sort of security force within the communities that they serve.
Thank you. Well, we're now at the part of our program where we will give each of our candidates the opportunity to offer a 2-minute closing statement. And the order of presentation will be candidate Wheeler, candidate Rayford, candidate Ayanna Rohn, and candidate Gonzalez. So let us begin. Candidate Wheeler.
Well, first of all, I want to thank the Urban League, and I want to thank KBOO, and most especially, I want to thank everybody who took time out of their busy days today to listen to this. This is an important election. And if the COVID crisis has taught us anything, it's that leadership matters. This is not the time to upset the apple cart. We've been doing that every election since the beginning of this century. This is a time to continue the good work we've done on housing, on homelessness, on shared economic prosperity, on making sure that we address our environmental issues, that we make sure that our city is effective and responsive to the needs of our community. If I've demonstrated anything, and again, I make mistakes like everybody else, but I've also demonstrated capacity to bring people together to get things done. And that's what's missing from the body politic today, is that willingness to bring people together, even if they have different views or different perspectives. As you know, I have made equity and inclusion an important part of my administration. I have been there for this community time and time again. I like to believe that's why the Oregonian and the Portland Tribune and Willamette Week and many, many others have endorsed my candidacy. And I'm very proud of the endorsements of State Senator Lou Frederick, former Senators Avell Gordley, Margaret Carter, State Representative Janelle Bynum, and my colleague Joanne Hardesty. Why do I call out those specific endorsements? It's because they do not give endorsements lightly when it comes to the Black community. And they have said, along with many, many others, that they want me to continue the good work that we are doing together. And I need your vote to continue it. So thank you for having me tonight. Thank you all for listening in. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Candidate Rayford.
I just want to start with saying that if you have not lost a child to police violence or to gun violence, don't tell us what's working. If you've not been displaced, if you've not experienced racism, disparities that are based on you being a woman or you being a brown person in America, don't tell us that you're getting it right, because you're not. And then the fact that you could say that on this program, which is the Urban League, which is an organization that is supposed to be standing up for the rights and the political access for Black Americans, to not even show humility when you speak about our elders supporting your candidacy in our city is just disingenuous, Ted. I supported you last time that you ran, and I've had a problem with it because within the first couple of weeks of your candidacy, of your inauguration, people were being murdered in our streets by the Portland police. The fact that you're smiling about it now is a problem. People were dying while they were unhoused in our communities. The fact that you jumped on the bandwagon and were able to, spearhead priorities that had already been in place, those movements happened because of the same people that you mentioned that have endorsed your campaign. Those families, those communities, their experiences, their shared time and efforts to make a more equitable life here in Portland, the resistance that you showed to people like myself, community members like myself that have been harmed in this city, it shows a very serious lack of care, of empathy. I'm ashamed that you're in this platform. I'm ashamed that there are people in my community that have to sit up and watch you be able to say some of the things that you say and to promote them as equitable. I hope that people that are tired of rhetoric and lip service, that know that this city needs an advocate, that needs a leader, someone who is substantial, someone who cares about it, someone who understands policy and is determined to change it. I hope that you will elect me as your next mayor. Please go to our site, teresarayfordformayor.com. Look for equity in your next leader. You can do as much research as you like about me. I love audits. Ted will tell you, a lot of the information that we've been able to talk about for the last 10 years, there weren't leaders demanding information about our problematic outcomes. As somebody who lost someone to gun.
Thank you, candidate Redford. And we will move on to candidate Ayanna Rohn.
Yes, and again, thank you all for being here. Michael, wonderful moderating. I know it's not easy, especially when we're remote. It's hard to stay connected, but we're all doing our very best. And this is some place where I don't believe keeping an apple cart upended just because it's upended is the right thing to do, especially if that apple cart is filled with rotten apples. What we need to think about is not re-electing someone this century, which actually former Mayor Bear Katz was elected in 2000, I believe. So we often overwrite history to lead successful women. But we need to talk about a change in leadership at a critical time, because now more than ever, what Portland needs is a compassionate, courageous mayor who's not going to take credit for the work of communities that are already coming together, as candidate Rayford has mentioned. These things go on in Portland regardless who's mayor. What we need is someone who is going to empower those communities, who is going to unleash their potential, who is going to make sure that what's happening in a city hall is not a barrier to them achieving their ideals and realizing success in their communities, because they think they know best, because they think they know how, and because they think they have all the answers. What we need is someone who understands that as we face these challenges, we also face great opportunities. There are so many ways that through this, Portlanders can begin to meet our climate action goals and really get those green jobs to the families that need them most, make intensified investments that help us keep our air quality clean and our vehicle miles traveled low, and make sure that our families are telecommuting and that every household has broadband, and that we're really shoring up our communities and our families, our working families, not through a mindset of austerity and budget cuts, but investing for the future. Because we know that through strategic infrastructure investments, through programmatic investments, through entrepreneurial and workforce investments, that we can actually start to make progress on things like climate action, housing affordability that's affordable with a lowercase a for a lot of Portlanders, and racial equality, so that we are truly a resilient city even after we recover from the COVID crisis. You can visit me at sarah2020.com to learn more about me, and I'll look forward to your vote on May 19th if you should choose to give it to me. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Candidate Gonzalez.
Thank you very much once again, Michael, and to the Urban League and to KBOO for helping bring this forward. I really appreciate everyone that's come out tonight, and whoever is going to be viewing this in the future after the live broadcast, for taking an interest in the race. With so many things out there to be concerned about, this could even seem like a distraction to pay attention to politics. But in reality, it's one of the most important things we need to be doing right now. All of the issues that came to us before COVID, homelessness, housing affordability, congestion, were all things that really required a different approach to leadership. The thinking that got us to that point is not the thinking that's going to get us out of this. And I believe right now more than ever, we do need a different kind of leadership, and one that has a bold vision, that is able to show and articulate to the city at large what it is that we are striving towards to become. Our mayor, while well-intended, I think is missing some critical areas where we are able to navigate how we embrace different perspectives, and to how we open up to the things that we do not currently see here in Portland today. The city of Portland is at a critical moment in time where it understands that the apple cart does have rotten apples in it, but we have to rebuild the apple cart itself, because before COVID, the apple cart was already showing signs of cracking. I think there's a lot of people on this call today that weren't necessarily pleased with that apple cart, and it wasn't really doing much for us. And so we have to not only think about upsetting the apple cart, because it's already been upset by COVID. What we come back to and how we rebuild that apple cart requires someone that knows how to see the lived experience of others as the thing that is most valuable. It's not our degrees that are going to get us out of this now, it's our humanity. And we need leaders with heart and mind, and I have the technical experience, the ability, and the heart. Visit my website, aussieforpdx.org. I would love to be able to share my ideas with you and to be able to engage. I'll be going deeper into this next week, so visit my site for more details. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's our forum to an end, and I do want to take a moment and gratefully thank our four candidates for the time that you spent with us this evening, but more importantly, for the path that your lives and commitment to this city has taken you on that has brought you to this moment. So we are deeply grateful. I also want to acknowledge our partners in this effort, particularly our colleagues at Open Signal, who have really been the infrastructure backbone in supporting this, our colleagues at KBOO, and for the folks who submitted the questions. We had a number of recommendations that we were able to weave in the themes to create the questions that we presented. I also want to take the moment and ask that people take a moment and look at all of the websites of our candidates, but also visit the website of the Urban League of Portland. This is an illustration of the work that we've done to make sure that we are supporting the needs of a broad range of people within this community, primarily African Americans, but the issues that we face are faced by issues across this region. And if we're able to lift the resolution and the clarity around the path forward for our community, we know that others will benefit as well. So please take a moment and look at ways in which we do that work and you can support us. We will be transitioning in a few moments to our second forum, which is a look at the candidates who are vying for the position of Multnomah County. Now I'm going to have a freeze. District Attorney. But it's good. I don't know the district attorneys very well, which is probably a good thing. But we would ask that you stay with us, and we have a very short promotional video that we'll be promoting. But in the meantime, I want to thank our candidates, release you to go about, I'm sure, what have been very busy schedules, and I'm sure it's not over now. But thank you for being with us, and we wish you good fortune.
If you look at like health disparities across Portland, even across the nation, it's similar, but across Portland, African American communities tend to have the worst health outcomes across the board. There's a ton of barriers and policies and systems that are in place that kind of play a role in why these health disparities exist. We do this work to kind of help dismantle all of that. Everybody deserves to live a long, happy, healthy life. We want to help to empower and uplift the African American community.
Now.
For a moment.
Hey there.
Good evening. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Okay.
Hi there.
Hi.
Good evening, Mike and Ethan. Thank you for joining us.
So we're right now off the live stream. It's just us, and we're just getting ready to transition because we just did the mayoral forum. One thing I just want to note, we're sort of getting everything ready, is that we're going to ask
Okay. Well, good evening. And welcome back to the Urban League of Portland's 2020 Black Votes Matter Candidate Forum. My name is Mike Alexander, and I serve as a board member of the Ayanna Vision Trust, as well as the former president and chief executive officer of the Urban League of Portland. And on behalf of President and CEO Nakangay Herman Johnson, as well as board chair Michael Llewellyn and the staff and board of the Urban League, it's my privilege to welcome you to tonight's forum. For the next 45 minutes to an hour, we will hear from two candidates for the office of Multnomah County District Attorney. This individual will serve as the chief legal officer for the county. And the office of District Attorney plays a significant role in setting the legal tone for the region. Within this jurisdiction, they decide whether to prosecute a case, what the specific charges will be against the accused, and whether to bring a case to the grand jury. The election to this office takes place during a time of unprecedented challenge, crisis, and urban calls for directing our efforts on a range of issues facing both the county, its residents, and most importantly, the African American community. So we thank you for joining us for this important opportunity to hear directly from the two gentlemen who have come forward with the desire to lead this work. And now please allow me to introduce tonight's candidates in alphabetical order. They are Ethan Knight and Mike Schmidt, and I want to welcome you both. I want to take a moment and just review a few ground rules for the event. And we ask first that our candidates keep their mics muted other than while they're actually speaking. It helps us to maintain some audio clarity for our audience. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement, and we will begin with candidate Knight, followed by candidate Schmidt. And then we will move on to asking the candidates to answer a series of questions. And each candidate will again have 2 minutes to respond, and there's no option for rebuttal. We have 12 questions in total, and for the first 6 questions, we will begin with candidate Schmidt responding, followed by candidate Knight. For our last 6 questions, we will begin with candidate Knight, followed by candidate Schmidt. We hope to get through our 12 questions, and if we can manage our time, and if people can be responsive to the consideration of limiting themselves to 2 minutes, we should be able to do that. If for any reason a candidate runs over that, we will notify them via personal prompt when there are 30 seconds left. And if they exceed the 2 minutes, then we'll notify the candidates in the audience that their time is up. So with that, let us begin with opening statements, and I invite candidate Knight to unmute and offer us your opening comments.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me this evening and for all those who are joining us on the live stream. My name is Ethan Knight, and I'm obviously one of the candidates for Multnomah County District Attorney. I'm running for Multnomah County District Attorney because I love this community, and I've spent over 2 decades in public service, and I hope to continue this work and my vision for a stable community, particularly in this time of crisis. Now, I've spent roughly the last 12 years as a federal prosecutor here in Portland during a number of administrations, handling a variety of cases: public corruption, violent crime, domestic terrorism, international terrorism, and espionage. And before that, I spent 8 years as a state prosecutor in Multnomah County, where I handled a range of offenses that they prosecute in that office, including environmental crimes and violent crimes. And I also helped start the community court program. And beyond that, as someone who grew up here in Portland, I've spent a tremendous amount of time active in the community, particularly working on access for justice issues within the legal community. And that informs my vision and why I'm here today. You know, I believe that the elected district attorney should lead an office that's caring, thoughtful, and does the best work possible with the mandate that that office has, and that is prosecuting the crimes that are brought before it. and does so in a manner that considers the community and the issues in the community. And a particular focus for me and a concern for me in this time of crisis is how we manage our lowest level offenses, how we handle those issues that touch on addiction and other problems in our community. And that informs my vision and my experience, and I look forward to sharing that with all of you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Candidate Schmidt.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here tonight. My name's Mike Schmidt, also running for district attorney, because I believe that we need major reform now in our criminal justice system. I started off my career as a public school teacher in the city of New Orleans from 2003 to 5, and I saw up front and close the school to prison pipeline. I saw my students and how they were impacted by the criminal justice system as witnesses to crime, victims of crime, and sometimes children of incarcerated parents, and then defendants themselves. So I decided I'd go to law school, and I came to Portland in 2005 and studied criminal law. I got a job in the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office, where I prosecuted from 2007 to 2013. And while I felt like I was helping people while I was there, I didn't feel like I was changing the system. So I got out, I started working in the legislature, and then ultimately landed with the Criminal Justice Commission, a state agency that focuses on criminal justice reform issues by improving our state system's effectiveness and efficiency. We use data and research to drive our decision-making and how we make investments to get at the root causes of crime. I've been the director of that state agency since 2015, where I've worked on issues such as racial profiling across the state, tracking and measuring that data, decreasing disparity in terms of drug convictions in Oregon, looking at the elimination of cash bail and how that impacts communities of color differently than others. So I've been working on criminal justice reform issues for the last 6 years. And when I saw the opportunity to run, I thought taking that data and research prospect and putting it to a DA's office is what we need. I came out with a 28-point bold platform, which you can see on my website. I've pledged to stand up to Trump and ICE and immigration to make sure we're protecting our immigrant communities, to hold police officers accountable, and to work with people when they actually get their lives back on track and are doing the right things, to meet them halfway with expungements to remove the things that we need to do. So I look forward to talking more. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. All right, we will begin with our first series of questions. And again, the orders will be Candidate Schmidt answering first, Candidate Knight answering second. Question number 1, despite advice from epidemiologists about how to reduce the spread of this dangerous virus, Oregon counties and the Department of Corrections have not acted to release people in prison amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you believe that the district attorney's office should support the release of incarcerated persons to reduce virus transmission during this ongoing public health emergency?
I absolutely do. I wrote a piece online about this. You can see at our website and connect with us on social media to look at that. I've been interviewed on this and at the City Club debate, which I think was almost a month ago at this point. I called at that time for us we should be at least at a minimum looking at people who then were 3 months away from release anyway, especially those people who were convicted of nonviolent offenses. I think a district attorney can stand up and be a voice of reason and say, when we need to do everything we can to protect the health of our communities. And it's not only for the people who are incarcerated inside of our facilities, but it's also for the people who work in those facilities and the communities that they live and serve in. We should be doing everything we can to stop the spread of this disease. And I'm very proud of the work that Oregon's done and us staying home, and we have definitely flattened the curve. But we're seeing across the country and even in Oregon that jails and prisons have been hotspots where this spreads. And when it does, it comes back into our community. So it's for all of our public safety and all of our health that we should be doing everything we can to comply with CDC guidelines. I think that we should be looking at people that have a small amount of time left to serve, where they've already served the majority of their sentence and can be safely released back to the community. And they should be accompanied with resources, so we make sure that we are doing everything we can to get them connected to housing and health, the health resources that they would need to be successful. So absolutely, we should be doing more to get people out of our prisons so that they can have a chance at complying, which we know is is going to be impossible to completely do, but everything we can possibly do, we should be doing at this point.
Thank you. Candidate Knight.
Thank you. Well, we have a public health crisis, and the answer to your question is yes, we should be doing what we can to decrease the population in jails and prisons where we can to help alleviate this public health crisis. And the question really is, how do we do it most efficiently and effectively and safely for everyone involved? So to talk a little bit about what's being done right now, Multnomah County has decreased its jail population a little over 20%, working in conjunction with the district attorney's office to ensure that low-level offenders are not serving jail sentences at this time. At the federal level, what we've done is we've increased our examination across the board of compassionate release motions. That is to focus on those who are both vulnerable and at a time in their sentence when they are in fact endangered. Now, hopefully, by the time either one of us assumes this office on January 1st of next year, we won't be confronted with this piece of the pandemic. There'll be other problems certainly trailing along. But then the question becomes, how do we implement this? And, Mike speaks to a very important piece, which is, how do we get services to folks who are getting released? That's a large problem, not just now, but in the system generally. I've been a strong advocate on the access to justice side of breaking down barriers, both as far as working with expungements, but also working with programs and probation officers to transition folks in the community. And that is the trickiest part of this right now, because most of the probation officers and the service providers I've spoken with are at home too. So it's all about the implementation and getting it right.
Thank you. Next question. Oregon has a higher rate of incarceration than California, Illinois, New York, and 20 other states. Per Multnomah County's own study, Black people are arrested, prosecuted, and incarcerated at much higher rates than other races in our community. In fact, Black children are indicted 13 times more often than white youth. How will you work to combat the systemic injustices that continue to damage our community?
Yeah, so this is something that I've been working on for the last 6 years at the state level. And so I'm familiar very much with the data that you talk about. Oregon ranks 24th or 25th, both for women and men, right, in terms of our incarceration rate. So those states that you named have lower rates than we do. And we've even seen that some of those states like New York have started and continue to decarcerate. And while they are doing that, while they are driving their incarceration rates down, crime is not going up. So we can do it. Other states have done it. Even Texas has done it. So Oregon can do a better job of using less incarceration and continue to get better public safety outcomes. So I've worked on this issue. We looked at possession of controlled substance in this state, and we saw that the exact disparity that you described. And I helped get legislation passed that dropped that penalty for possession of controlled substance from a felony to a misdemeanor. And what we've seen is that disparity rate for felony convictions across our state has dropped precipitously. I do the same thing as district attorney. It starts with looking at the data. And so we need to start tracking what data, who's coming into our prosecution offices, who's being referred with arrests, how their plea deals and convictions are. I have a track record of building transparent data dashboards that people can use and go online and see exactly that information. Because unless you're measuring it, you're not going to ever know whether or not the things that you're trying to do are having an impact. So it starts with measurement. And then once you start doing that, it drives the conversation. If you see the disparity, you get to ask the next question, which is, what is driving this? Is it policy? Are we policing communities differently? And start talking to those communities that are most affected to see what they know, because the people who are usually closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So that's how I would work on that issue, just as I've done at the Criminal Justice Commission.
Thank you. Candidate Knight.
Thank you. Well, look, I've been in the system over 2 decades and have seen this from a number of different perspectives. And you can lower the incarceration rate. In other words, you can get Oregon from the mid-20s, up to 15 by simply decreasing the number of people who are incarcerated. But that, of course, doesn't really get to the racial disparities that are endemic in the system. And to me, really, that's the issue. And the question is, how do you confront that? And I think it's a multi-front war. I mean, I don't think there's any one silver bullet. You know, you have institutional racism at so many different points in the system, you know, at the entry point to the criminal justice system, the exit point, and then other places as well. So let me touch on a few of those. You know, I think a first piece, you know, Mike alludes to possession of a controlled substance. That's important, but that's not what's driving the prison population in Oregon. You need to look at those sentences, those longer sentences that are driving incarceration rates for violent crime. And then you need to ensure that there is parity to the best you can in sentencing so that, you know, people from underserved communities and racial minorities are getting the same sentences as others. I mean, that's simply what you have to do at the outset. And data is part of that. Internal tracking in DA's offices is part of that. In other words, when you look at when plea offers are made and when sentences are imposed, tracking that information and working with deputies to do that, because that's what's driving the incarceration piece. But there's a larger issue too, and I've worked on this in the legal community for years, and that is first ensuring that, you know, a district attorney's office reflects the community that it serves, and we need a more diverse, frankly, legal community and legal profession. Because when these decisions are all being made by people, frankly, who look like Mike and I, at the end of the day, that really doesn't get at some of the things I alluded to first, which are the institutional drivers of racism that may be everything from getting a home loan to disparities in education, which, you know, overlap and involve themselves in the system in ways most folks don't appreciate. So we have to approach it different ways to really get at the problem.
Thank you. Our next question. The mandatory minimum prison sentences required by Measure 11 have had severe consequences on African Americans and Native Americans. Prosecutors' use of the law has skyrocketed the number of people imprisoned in Oregon. What are your views on Measure 11 and its impacts?
So I've been very clear about this throughout this race. Mandatory sentencing, I don't think makes sense. It was passed by the voters at a time when crime across this country was at historically high levels. And the predominant way of people's thinking was that we have to just get tougher and tougher on crime. 2.5 decades later, as you say, our prison population has skyrocketed. And in Oregon, since the passage of Measure 11, it's almost tripled. So absolutely, it is a major cost of incarceration. It's a major cost of the driver of costs in our system, where our Department of Corrections budget is now almost $2 billion biannually. So we should be looking at how we can change that. So I think mandatory minimums are a bad idea. We should go back to allowing judges to make decisions on an individual case-by-case basis, where the prosecution makes their best argument to the judge, defense attorney makes their best argument, the judge hears from the community, from the victim of the crime, and then they make the decision based on all of the facts and everything in front of them on what that person should receive as a sentence. I think if we did that, we would give the judges more flexibility, and we'd start to see our use of incarceration decrease with ending mandatory minimums. And then to your other point about how it's driven disparity, you know, those mandatory sentences can have devastating impacts in communities where we're sending people disproportionately to prison, and we're undermining entire families and networks when we're sending people who would have potential to support families and be parents, like when I was teaching in high school and I had children whose parents were incarcerated. So I think we should end that failed policy of 2.5 decades. The experiment has lasted long enough. It's driven our incarceration rates and costs. And let's let judges decide what the sentences should be based on all of the evidence.
Thank you. Candidate Knight.
Thank you. Well, you know, I believe after spending a lot of time in the system that for the most serious offenses, for the rapes and the robberies, you still need Measure 11, and for the murder cases predominantly. You know, I think there's a separate issue with racial disparity that we need to approach more aggressively. And I'll just say, you know, I don't agree with the proposition that if you eliminated Measure 11, incarceration rates are going to go down, because what happened in the mid-90s is you had, you know, significant disparities in the way those sentences were handed out. In other words, you know, a judge in Coos County would often give a sentence that was maybe 5 to 6 times more than the judge in Multnomah County for the same offense. And while I agree that we need to do a better job of addressing, you know, the inherent racial disparity and impact of the entire system, not just Measure 11, what happens is you get about net usage that's the same of the system. You just get wildly different outcomes. And I understand that, not all cases are the same, certainly, but it shouldn't be that somebody in Coos County gets 30 years for a rape and somebody gets 2 years in Multnomah County. So I think what we need to do is think about better ways, and I alluded to this in the last answer, of measuring and looking at how folks are charged and sentenced in the system across the board to address the disparities. But for those most serious of offenses that we have the system for, I think we need to be mindful of having some continuity in the process.
Thank you. All right, our next question. Last year, the Urban League was successful in passing new state law to make it easier, quicker, and cheaper for Oregonians to expunge past convictions for cannabis-related activities that would now be legal under state law. To help local residents have better access to housing and employment, the district attorney could proactively move to vacate many of those criminal records. Do you support doing so? And what, if anything, will you do to help clear the records of people in drug-related offenses? Candidate Schmidt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is huge. It used to be when I was a little kid, there was a movie, it was like Dick Tracy, and it was like, if you do the crime, you do the time, right? Was the saying. And what we know now is that when you get convicted of a crime, that conviction follows you forever. Even if you've successfully completed probation or you've gotten out of prison and you're trying to get your life back on track, that conviction will continue to follow you and haunt you and prevent you from getting jobs and housing and educational grants and all kinds of things that are going to negatively impact you, your family, and your community. So I will do a lot on this issue. First of all, I think we need to completely rewrite our statutes around expungement. They are extremely convoluted and overcomplicated, and they're not based on research or evidence. The research shows that after 5 years of not committing a new offense in our community, you're no more likely than anybody else to do so. Yet we make people wait twice as long, 10 years, to get their records expunged. I think that's too long. So one, we need to change the law. But as a district attorney, I can have policies in the office that can work on that. And one of the things that I'm willing to do and explore is putting into plea agreements that if you successfully complete your sentence and you don't get arrested for any new crimes, that you don't have to wait 10 years. I will agree after 5 years that you can come back and get your record expunged, and I will join your motion to the court to do that. And we'll make it part of the plea agreement to give people a carrot. A lot of the criminal justice system uses sticks, but incentives are actually more effective than always using the stick. So give people incentives to get their lives back on track. I will join them in helping remove those barriers to their success in the community. And I'll work with the groups that are supporting me, like I've talked with Apano and Unite Oregon and others, to use their networks and bring their connections to the district attorney's office to help get expungements.
Thank you. Candidate Knight.
Yeah, this is easy. I think we're in agreement. I would work to lower barriers for access to expungement, and I'd be willing to explore at the legislative level, looking at decreasing the number of years depending on what the crime is. Some cases like sex offenses, they're just harder to get expunged by statute for good reason. But absolutely, your question started out asking about drug offenses. And I think that's a particular set of offenses, that are problematic for folks. And we need to do a better job of getting those felonies off people's records, frankly, if they're looking to get back into society. But, there's another piece of this that I think goes to your question that's simple, but even more important, and that is making it easy and cheap to get an expungement. We have laws on the books oftentimes where we say, hey, folks can get an expungement. And I've talked to people in the legal aid context, but it's hard to do. You're talking about folks who don't have a lot, who don't have access to the system, may not trust the system. So we need to do a better job on the legal aid side of encouraging on the criminal justice side and giving access to and making cheaper the opportunity to get a crime expunged. Because unless you have that access and make it easy, it's all academic. It's easy to talk about at the legislative level, but it doesn't help someone who needs to get a job or needs to get housing and needs to get that expungement done now.
Mike, I think you're on mute.
There we go. Thank you. The public has recently learned about the improper investigation, arrest, and prosecution of Michael Fesser by the Westland Police Department with assistance from the Portland Police and Multnomah County District Attorney. What do you think when you heard about the wrongs done to Mr. Fesser? And if elected, what would you do to ensure that your office is not involved in a similar injustice in the future?
Yeah, I think like so many people in our community, shocked and outraged to see what essentially was what people, especially in the Black community, have been telling us is going on for a long time, that the good old boy network is alive and well, and that a police chief can send text messages back and forth with a towing company guy and effectuate an arrest based on what essentially was an employee who was voicing his concerns about being discriminated against in an employment context. It's absolutely frightening to see how that authority could so easily be abused. But again, you know, this is something that this one is plain, and they got caught, and we've seen the text messages, and it's horrible. But this is something that I've heard from multiple people, especially in the Black community, that this has been going on for a long time. So I think we have to be vigilant about this. I think we need to believe people when they say that these things are happening. Senator Lou Frederick tells a great story about his experiences of being pulled over and having his taillight get popped, you know, as an excuse, as a pretext to get pulled over. I mean, I think we need to believe people when they say these things are happening. As district attorney, you know, I will obviously put policies into place, like I believe there probably are, that we don't condone this kind of behavior, but we can't also be complicit in trying to help move these cases through the criminal justice system more quickly with plea agreements or otherwise, because we're concerned about protecting the civil liability that a police officer or police agency might be incurring for doing this type of misconduct. I think the district attorney has to rise above that and not be a part of that. And then where there are crimes, and it will be interesting to see because this is being investigated, where there are crimes, the district attorney should zealously prosecute those.
Thank you. Candidate Knight.
Well, I mean, you asked my reaction, and obviously it's outrageous. I mean, I don't, you know, it's not really the words I used, but I mean, what do you say? And, you know, like Mike, I mean, I've talked to folks who say, you know, obviously this happens a lot more than you know and you think. And that is the most disconcerting piece. And so to answer your question, what would I do? What would my office do? And I have to be careful because my current office is investigating this. Look, I've handled public corruption cases in the past and official misconduct cases. And we can set up committees and talk about it and talk about, you know, the problems created by circumstances like this. But when there's, you know, official misconduct, it needs to be prosecuted, investigated thoroughly so that people have faith in the system. And I think it's simple. You know, you need to aggressively go after these circumstances. And that does start with having investigators maybe walled off from the specific agency, having conflicts in place so that people are listened to when they have a grievance, so we can ensure that that grievance is heard and doesn't get stopped at the door before it even gets to, you know, my desk. So I don't need to take any more time than to state the obvious, which is, you know, this is just, it's crazy.
Thank you. Our next question. As a candidate for district attorney, you're aware that Portland police are subject to a settlement agreement with the United States Department of Justice because of its pattern of using excessive force against members of the public. While the US DOJ and city officials claim that they have met the terms of the settlement, community members, including such groups as the Albina Ministerial Alliance and the Urban League, adamantly disagree that the police department has improved. What is your assessment of the police department's adherence to the settlement agreement?
So, you know, this is something that I will have to be looking into a lot more once I get, if I get elected into the office. You know, I see the stories and I hear from groups like the Albina Ministerial Alliance and others about the shortcomings, and I hear from law enforcement and police in the ways that they believe that they have met it. I think it really is going to have to be assessing, what were the specific mandates that were set out, and then what are the goals and metrics, and how do we measure those things? For me, again, it always goes back to data. How are we objectively measuring that we're hitting the goals that we are supposed to be doing? Obviously, mental illness in our streets continues to be a huge problem. I'm very heartened by seeing programs like Joanne Hardesty's Portland Street Response pilot project. I think that that's another great way that we can look at decreasing the incidence of when somebody experiencing a mental health crisis gets into a violent altercation with police officers. So I'd like to see a lot more programs like that. But for me, my strategy really is going to be, as it has been with everything else, to work with community members, to work with law enforcement, to hear the perspectives, and then just try to work through and see how can we really measure these things in a way that everybody trusts the data and trusts the outcomes, and so that we can agree that we are making progress in these areas.
Thank you. Candidate Knight.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to speak in too much detail to the department's work with the city, and it's not something I've worked on specifically in my office. But I will say that I actually disagree a little bit, that I think this is an area where we can't be overly reliant on data. Because objectively, of course, the statement's been made that, everyone's in compliance, and the criteria have been met. And I think that the trouble is sometimes when, we have consent decrees of any kind, is we have objective criteria and they're met, yet you talk to folks in the community and, they understandably say, well, I'm still seeing something different, or I'm not seeing a change. And so you may objectively have your criteria met, and there may be metrics that will tell you that X number of trainings have taken place and improvements have been made, but it doesn't get at the heart of this, which is, we have to view all of these issues, I think, on an ongoing rolling basis. In other words, constantly be listening to where the community is, where law enforcement is, and make improvements on an ongoing basis. And get away from this idea that you flip a switch or one day, you've filled out the form and you're done on any side. I just think we can't improve or really recognize where we're making mistakes unless we're constantly sort of aware in that way that maybe changes need to be made. So I think, progress has been made clearly, but you talk to folks and not enough. And so what I would do is continue to listen to ensure that improvements have been made.
All right. Thank you. And for our remaining questions, we're going to reverse our order of response. So we will start with Candidate Knight and then follow up with Candidate Schmidt. The question, if elected, how would you address the public's ongoing concerns about police use of force against unarmed community members?
I would take a holistic approach. I think that if we just focus on these terrible events when they occur, we kind of miss the larger picture, which is a history of mistrust. We miss sort of the upstream and downstream causes of police use of force against particularly vulnerable members of our community. And so two things. First, when we talk about actual acts of use of force, I would, endeavor to embrace as much transparency as possible to ensure that when we have something that is examined and investigated within what the law allows, people know what happened. But people aren't understandably always satisfied by the outcome. And I think we need to think then, what are we doing wrong upstream or downstream in these cases? Why are they taking place? Is it a training issue? Are there other issues where a community is over-policed? Are we not getting the right kind of treatment to certain parts of our community that lead to more interaction with law enforcement? So to me, it's a big picture, holistic approach, because no one's ever going to be satisfied with the outcome of one investigation. I've seen that. And so we really need to think about what can we do to decrease the likelihood of these ever occurring.
All right. Thank you. Candidate Schmidt.
Yeah, so on this issue, I have called for, from the beginning, I think that we need to have independent investigations to look especially at officer-involved shootings that end up being lethal in our community. It's not even that necessarily the wrong things have been done, but the fact is that prosecutors and police officers by the very nature of their job are, they interact on a daily basis. They're working together. They understand, hey, how's your kid doing? Go to the soccer game. I mean, you build these kind of very friendly relationships, and that's not a bad thing. That's part of having a coworker. But then when suddenly the prosecution changes or the investigation changes and you have to be investigating that person, I think the community has a right to say, we'd like to see somebody independent of that relationship take a look at this case. So I've called for, I think the Oregon Department of Justice would be an agency that could be in that position to come in, and they have the expertise, they have the experience, they know how to do these cases, they're fantastic lawyers, and they could do that. They're not connected with the local agencies on a daily basis. They could look at it objectively and give the community some assurances that, the fix isn't in. Like we just talked about in Michael Fesser's case, there's not a good old boy network situation, because there's at least some outside eyes on what is going on, and then make the findings available to the public as best we can in terms of how a case progresses. But I think we need independent eyes to look at these investigations.
Great, thank you. Our next question. Describe a time when injustice impacted you or a loved one. If elected, how will you use your privilege as a white male in a powerful position to partner with communities of color? Candidate Knight.
Thank you. I mean, you speak at the end of the question to the injustice, really that I've observed, because as a privileged white male, frankly, it's injustice that I've observed, not that I've experienced. And really, the first sign of it I saw candidly was as a child. I grew up until the age of 9 in a part of Chicago where I was in the minority in my elementary school. It was the majority Black, and I was the minority. Until I moved to Portland, Oregon, where those roles were reversed significantly. And, what I saw, the injustice I saw at a young age, was, when I got here to Portland, the few minority kids in my elementary school were treated very different than they were when I was in Chicago. And, that's a very general example, but it speaks to the fact that these things start early. And, that it was, candidly, the discrimination and injustice that I saw at that age, which we've all seen at different stages of our life. And I saw when I was living in North Carolina for a period and other times in my life, sadly are common. And I guess when I talk about how that informs my decision-making and my view of the world and what I would do as a district attorney, I think back to those experiences I had when I was a kid and remember what it was like to have those roles reversed at an early age and to see how, kids through no fault of their own were treated very differently in different circumstances and how that is for adults in the system or out of the system. And I try then to keep an open mind and open eyes to that injustice everywhere I go and throughout the criminal justice system and frankly outside of it in all walks of life.
Thank you. Candidate Smith.
Yeah, when I was a teacher in New Orleans, like I started off this conversation talking about, I had a student. You're not supposed to have favorite students as a teacher, but he was definitely one of my favorites. And he was just this bubbly, outgoing, everybody loved him. One day I bought, as a class prize, I got him a book of love poems. He memorized all 50 poems in that book. And I think he tried them on every single girl in the school. He was just the kid everybody loved. And one day he came into class and after a long weekend, and he was just down. His affect was down. And it was so out of character. And I just said to him, I said, "Hey man, what's going on?" And he told me how he was arrested over the weekend and he spent the entire weekend in solitary confinement. He was 14 years old. He told me that the only thing he could do to stay sane while he was in the jail cell was to count the braids on his head. He described to me the situation that led to that. He was trying to go to the corner store to get milk for his siblings. He walked up on a scene where police officers had another man down on the ground and they turned on him and ordered him down to the ground. One of the police officers, according to my student, reached down and then pretended to pull a bag of marijuana out of his back pocket. And I say pretended because It turns out that that interaction was captured on a dash cam video, and my student was released and all charges were dropped after he spent the weekend in jail. And although he didn't get drawn into the criminal justice system in terms of getting prosecuted and made a defendant, because fortunately for him, there was video evidence that what the officer had done was wrong, it completely changed who he was, his whole personality, his whole affect. I keep that story with me. I experienced many other stories like that in New Orleans, but that story really impacted me and drove me to want to study criminal law when I got to law school.
Thank you. Our next question. During the campaign, you have each noted that you believe that cash bail system is inequitable and inefficient. What steps would you take to reduce the rate of pretrial incarceration in Multnomah County? Candidate Knight.
Well, I mean, obviously the first step when you're talking about eliminating cash bails, what do you replace it with? And so I think the step that you need to take that does it in a fair and equitable way is a system that takes into account, dangerousness and risk of appearance. Those are the factors that they've used in Washington, D.C. and a couple other places that have eliminated cash bail. And so that's a system I would embrace. That the key piece then is in the implementation. I mean, you can say eliminate it for certain groups of offenses, but you got to replace with something. It's then how do you equitably and fairly decide whether to detain people pre-trial, and particularly with an eye toward economic, racial, ethnic disparities, and ensuring that you don't disproportionately detain folks pre-trial for one group or another. What you need to do in that process is work with probation officers. I've looked at studies that examine this to really identify objective factors that go to risk of dangerousness. How many times have they failed to appear in the past? Is it a domestic violence case with a victim where a restraining order is present? So it's in the implementation to ensure you do it right. But obviously cash bail, needs to go. I don't think there's much disagreement there. And then the question is, how do you thoughtfully and correctly replace it?
Thank you. Candidate Schmidt.
Yeah, this is an issue that I've been working on since 2016, when I got to go to a conference in New Mexico, which is a state that has largely decreased its reliance on cash bail. I don't know that it's completely eliminated, but by and large, they have. And I was exposed to the idea that, cash bail fails us on both sides. It keeps poor people in who are not a danger to our community and who would show up. And it lets dangerous people out who actually can come up with the money. And we've seen some really horrible cases in this region where we've seen terrible results from people who have come up with the money and bailed out. So we agree it's a terrible system, it's inequitable, and it does lead to disparity in our criminal justice system, in our jails. So for me, I started on that in 2016. I got legislation passed in 2017 to require the state to study that. It's currently in front of a group called the Public Safety Task Force. I'm hoping that they will have recommendations for the next session. So part of my goal would be, as the district attorney, to go down to Salem and to advocate with lawmakers and legislators on how we can change the system. We do need more resources for pretrial supervision. That's going to be a key component. But there are also lower resource things that we can do that have been demonstrated to work, like sending somebody a text message that the day that they have to show up to court. Just like a dentist would send me one if I have a dentist appointment, we got to send someone else a text message and say, hey, you have court today. Studies have shown that that can drop fail to appear rates by 15%. So there are things that we can do to improve our pretrial system and still allow people to go about in the community as long as they aren't a danger immediately and that they will show up. So those are the key factors. Those are the only things that judges should be concerned with in terms of whether or not to hold people. And so then it looks at, as the DA, I'd advocate on the state level, but then office policies and looking at areas where I would not be requesting cash bail up until we can change that law.
Right. Thank you. Our next question. The Oregon District Attorneys Association lobbies for and against various laws in Oregon. The association has been adversarial to social justice and civil rights efforts. In fact, some have observed that the Multnomah County DA should have more progressive influence on their policies due to our county's size. If elected, How would you and the attorneys who report to you engage with ODAA in the future?
Well, I agree with sort of the premise at the end of the question that the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office should have a more progressive influence on the larger body of DAs in the state and legislative initiatives because of its size, and frankly, not just because of its size, because in my view, and I suspect Mike's as well, those are the right policies typically in a lot of areas. And this county has been forward-leaning in a number of areas. And probably where we disagree then is what do you do with that when you work with or against the ODAA? I've been out of the state system for, over a decade. I don't particularly have a dog in the fight with the ODAA. I've not worked with them. But my view is that if you want to get things done, it's better to be in the room than outside the room. And so if you need to engage the other district attorneys in the state to move them in a certain direction on cash bail or any of the other issues we've spoken about, you're going to need them with you to do that. And so that's kind of my view generally about engaging that group to address some of the issues we've talked about tonight and we've talked about in the campaign.
Thank you. Candidate Schmidt?
Yeah, I've worked with the Oregon District Attorneys Association down in Salem, and I've observed firsthand exactly the kinds of things that the question brings up. I've seen them lobby against things that I think people in Multnomah County would readily support to see reform happening in their criminal justice system. I'm running on a very bold platform in this race, talking about the need to end the death penalty in this state, the need to end mandatory sentencing, cash bail, and other things. So I've said from the beginning of this campaign, when first asked about this, that I'd be willing to leave the District Attorneys Association. I don't think that I can both run on a progressive platform of reform and then pay dues from the county's budget into their association so that they could lobby against the very reforms that I claim to be championing as a candidate for this race. That's not to say that there can't sometimes be common grounds and that we would find opportunities to work together when it makes sense and it aligns with the needs of this community. But, I'm going to put Multnomah County first in how we're going to work in the state. I'm proud to be supported by many legislators, the chairs of both judiciary committees. We will have a great opportunity to be leaders in this state if I'm elected to continue to work and push on criminal justice reform. And if the Oregon District Attorneys Association changes their views on some of those issues, I'd happily embrace that change and work with them to accomplish that. But assuming that doesn't happen anytime soon, I'm going to have to do what I'm running on and stand up for the things and the reform that I think needs to happen in this state now.
Thank you. Our next question. What are your plans to recruit more Black, Native, and other lawyers of color to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office? Candidate Knight.
Thank you. Well, I think I mentioned this before as being really one of the many pieces in trying to approach the issues of racial disparity in the system. And this is something I've actually looked at. I was vice president of the Oregon State Bar, and we took a look at this issue statewide in hiring. And I've done a lot of work talking with folks in law firms. I'm currently in my office at the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Hispanic Affairs Coordinator, and we've looked at this in the context of hiring. And so what do you do? One, you actively recruit. You go out there and you make people know that in prosecution, an area where a lot of folks feel like they're not welcome, that they're not only welcome, that we need a variety of different viewpoints and backgrounds in an office, in a large office that reflects the community. There are more nuanced parts of recruiting too. I've talked to folks about going to law schools out of state that are more diverse, quite frankly, than the 3 law schools we have in the state. To try and change the demographics and the numbers of the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. And I've talked to folks on the hiring front, particularly at law firms, about strategically how you do that and how you make those changes. Because I think that the diversity of the workforce like that often gets overlooked, particularly in prosecution, in DA's offices, but it couldn't be more important in really confronting a lot of the issues we've talked about this evening.
Great. Thank you. Candidate Schmidt.
So, locally, I would engage a lot of the partners who are supporting me in this campaign. I think that they have tremendous networks, and I've already talked to a lot of young people in Apano, in Unite.
Hopefully, please go right ahead.
Like I was saying, not sure exactly where I got muted, but working with the organizations that have been supporting me in this campaign. I've talked to young people who are active in Apano, who are active in Unite Oregon, East County Rising, the Latino Network. So, they have great networks. I've also done some talking at high schools. I think it's never too early to start and get people excited about the prospects of coming into a career of law enforcement. Obviously, colleges, the same thing, talking to college classes and law school classes as well to get people invested and engaged and wanting to, like I was when I was just getting out of law school, somebody who wanted to be a change in the system. We have to harness that. I've seen district attorneys from across the country, like DA Krasner and DA Rachel Rollins in Boston, Krasner's in Philadelphia, Kim Fox in Chicago. And they are going around the country to law schools to seek out people. Portland, Oregon, Multnomah County is an absolutely gorgeous place. We all complain about how people don't leave when they come and visit us. I think that we have a lot of selling points. I would like to do the same kind of thing that those other DAs, those progressive DAs from around the country are doing. And so I would take advantage of that and those networks to reach out and do the same kind of recruiting that they're doing, because I think it is absolutely crucial, especially for a lot of the reforms we've talked about, to have more diverse perspectives in the office.
Great. Thank you. Gentlemen, we have used more time than we have allotted. So we're going to skip our last question, but I am going to allow you both to give your closing comments, and we will reverse order again. So we will begin with candidate Schmidt and then close with candidate Knight.
Well, thank you for the conversation. Thank you, hosts. Thank you, Mike, for moderating this. Like I said at the outset, I'm running because I believe that we need major reform now in our criminal justice system. And I think, and based on the reception that we're receiving in the community with this campaign, that people agree. What we are doing is just not working. It's not working for communities of color. It's not even working for good public safety in a lot of ways. When we see recidivism rates that are 50 and 60%, when we see that our jails, when you talk to our sheriff, or our prisons, when you talk to our Department of Corrections, their directors are saying that they are the largest homeless shelters in our community. They are the largest treatment providers, addiction treatment, mental health treatment. We've built a system that is just not working, and we need some major reform. I was really pleased today to be endorsed by the Oregonian, to be endorsed by the Willamette Week, yesterday to be endorsed by the Mercury, joining the broad coalition of people endorsing me in this campaign and this vision of bold criminal justice reform, like the entire county commissioners, the sheriff of the county, the groups that I've talked about already, labor unions. So this is a really broad-based coalition of people who know that we need major reform now, and that we can do things better, but we need to be willing to do some things differently. So that's why I'm running. I got my ballot today. Hopefully you got yours. So I hope that you marked the box next to Mike Schmidt.
All right, thank you. Candidate Knight.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, for moderating this evening and for having me here. This has been great, and I appreciate the thoughtful questions. As I said at the outset, I'm running because I love this community, and I've spent 20 years as an advocate and a public servant in this community. And that's what roots, my vision for what we need to do in criminal justice and in the district attorney's office in the years ahead. We are entering a particularly challenging time. And I think, that is something we all need to think of, both on the budget front, but also socially and economically. And that's why my experience and credibility in this community matter right now. And that's why I'm proud to be endorsed by the current district attorney, Rod Underhill, first responders, a broad coalition of folks within the legal community who know that this is nuanced work, important work, and to do it right, we'll need someone with the knowledge and expertise in the years ahead. And let me just say that, I think there are a lot of things we do need to change and reform in the system, but there are some things we do right. And it's picking the things we need to fix and building the coalition and getting all the stakeholders together to fix those, to end cash bail, to address disparities in the system, to do those while we're also mindful of the vulnerable victims we do have in the community, particularly in areas like child abuse and domestic violence. And we give those folks a voice because they don't have a voice. And so it's that balance and that experience that I bring to the table and that I hope to project upon this community and work on in this community in the years ahead as your next district attorney. So thank you again for the opportunity this evening, and I very much enjoyed our conversation.
All right. Well, I thank you both for your willingness to step into this work, for the enlightened discourse that was brought to our time tonight. And we are very eager to see where the community makes their determination on this critical role. I want to also thank our partners for this evening, Open Signal and KBOO. This has been a very important dialogue and important time for us. And as we say, not only do Black votes matters, but Black voices matter as well. And we encourage you to not only take full advantage of the choices that we have in this election season, but to also be an active participant in the census as well. Our voices and our numbers are critically important to our future, and I ask that as a community and as a city, we take full advantage of making sure that we're represented. And lastly, I would ask you to, again, take time to look on the Urban League website, familiarize yourself with the work of the organization, and we certainly would welcome feedback on this forum and also any support that you can offer to us as a nonprofit organization who do this work on a daily basis with resources that we would love to see strengthened so that our impact can grow. With that, we are going to bid everyone good evening and farewell, and thank you all for your time tonight, for your attention, and for the quality of our discourse this evening. Thanks very much.